to do before we... There we go. You heard it. You heard it from me first, and that was confirmation. So before we move into Emma's presentation, I'd like to present our artist in residence, Okani Shitsu, who's the maker of the paintings that we see on either side of the stage here. And I'd just like to spend a couple of minutes with Okani. She can tell us a little bit about her work and how the paintings fit into what we're discussing today. So, Okani, over to yourself.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm Okani, I'm from Zimbabwe, and I'm a Zimbabwean British artist. I studied computational art, which is using code and technology to make artwork. So these are analog, but I say that as a basis because the computational artwork was made to be responsive to the viewer. And so that's when I started thinking about working on mirrors. So just a few words to say, beauty gets a really bad rap in contemporary art. And yet, nevertheless, it's something to which I'm drawn and something to which I aspire. I consider myself mostly an abstract painter, but the materials that I choose to paint on are not typically canvas, although that has been known to happen from time to time, and somebody here has one of those pieces. But I choose the material depending on the language, on the conversation that I want to have. Sort of like the language you might use, the difference between an email, maybe prayer and poetry. The materials kind of respond to what I'm trying to say in that way. And I started painting on mirrors using the transparent glass enamels that you see here. So because I wanted the viewer to be part of the work, to see themselves in the work, I was a bit tired and frustrated with art being this thing that was sort of looked at as a scientific object and poured over. And I really wanted to invite the person to be a part of, to be part of the work. But it's also a bit of a confrontational choice to paint on a mirror because I'm asking you to really confront yourself and to see yourself in a material that's mostly reserved for saints in our stained glass in churches. Who are you when you are confronted with yourself, and who are you when you're confronted with light? And I was sort of beguiled in a way by this material when I first started working with it about 6 years ago, and into a sort of confession. And these pieces were made shortly after I'd read Dante's Divine Comedy, and I thought about what it might be like to catch a reflection of yourself in the rivers of flowing light that are described as heaven. And I was thinking also about another river of flowing light in the rainbow, and that meaning of commitment and a sense of dynamism, and what that might call us to do. So these sort of paintings, as I think of them, are sort of light bending. They're a bit wily, a bit obedient, a little bit like me, playful and mercurial, but they're really an assertion of life, both now and eternal. Please do come and see them.
Thank you, Okani. Emma Mason is Professor of English and Comparative Literature Studies at the University of Warwick, and her research interests and her teaching place her very much at the centre of the conversation that we are having at Power of the Word. Her interests: poetry, Christianity and literature, Catholic theology and literature in the long 19th century, and that interest in the 19th century in particular has issued in work on John Henry Newman, Cowper, John Clare, and especially Christina Rossetti. Emma's last book, Christina Rossetti, Poetry, Ecology and Faith, OUP 2018. And she's also the editor of Collected Poems of Elizabeth Jennings, collection appeared in 2012. She is also convener editor with Mark Knight, who Bloomsbury monograph series called New Directions in Religion and Literature. And it's terrific to have you with us today, and thank you very much for coming along. And the title is Teaching Christian Mysticism in the Secular Universe, which is hopefully a forthcoming book on this theme. So we're looking forward to getting a flavour of that today. And thanks very much.
Thank you, and thank you so much to Francesca for organising this and inviting me. There's a sort of almost irresistible joke that I feel like I have to pretend that I'm going to now give my paper on two of the greatest novelists of all time, Charlotte Yonge and Graham Greene. But I feel like I won't make that joke because it would be crass. So today I will share my thoughts about teaching mystical theology in the university and other educational spaces. My focus is the university, but I am interested in what it might mean to teach mystical theology in schools too. By mysticism, I mean an entering into the divine through the cooperation of love and intellect within the person, within the framework of the church. And by teaching mystical theology, I mean engaging in a tradition of writing focused on encounters with God. And those can be taught in an English department or a theology department. I am in an English department, and I'll say a bit more about that later. I follow Vladimir Lossky's claim that mysticism is always theological and that theology is always mystical. And my academic interest at the moment, so the research that I'm doing at the moment, is on some of these women. These images show Michael Field, Alice Meynell, Edith Stein, Rachel Maritain, Gertrude von Lefort, and Carol Hauslander. And these are all women writing in Europe between the 1880s and the 1940s who are Catholics and in various ways are called mystics and write about mysticism. But I won't be talking about all of these women. I will return to Edith Stein towards the end of the paper to give an example of the kind of teaching of mystical theology that I think might be useful. So when I refer to teaching mystical theology in a literature context, I simply mean asking students to read writers from Origen to Hildegard, Gregory of Nyssa to Dionysius, the Desert Mothers and Fathers, Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, Julian of Norwich, Richard Roller, Catherine of Siena, and of course, Ignatius. While these writers cannot be confined to a single set of ideas, many of them are interested in the theological and philosophical meaning of being, the soul, grace, and prayer. And those are the four ideas that I think are most central to the thinking about mystical theology in the classroom. And I should say one of the other reasons I'm so interested in this particular group of women is the way in which they engage a dwelling with and a praise of God through Jewish and Christian mysticism, as do some of the earlier mystics that I've already mentioned. But how should we teach and study these writers and their relation to God in an educative system in which theology is so undervalued, where theology departments are being shut down, funding withdrawn? And what will happen to the study of the humanities more broadly when we excise theology from curricula and research? I don't know if I can answer these questions, but that's what I'm going to talk about today. And there are three rough parts of this talk. First, I'm going to say what I mean by the secular university. The second, I will have a look at a few of the critical debates about whether theology has a place in the secular university. And the third, I'll share some of my thoughts about the importance of teaching mystical theology. And if you would like to skip to the end of my paper and just know what my argument is that mystical theology should be taught as a compulsory subject at every stage of education, from the age of 5 to university level in the UK. I can only speak to a UK context, and I firmly believe that. And I will say that my mum was a primary school teacher, and she sort of agrees. Probably not too much, actually, but that's basically what I am arguing. Now, as a literary critic, I will try here not to idealize theology, although maybe I should after David's paper, but I also think it must be taught, not least to produce thoughtful theologians. As David and I would agree, we need theologians, and we don't, seemingly, we need thoughtful, good theologians, and giving everyone access to the meaningfulness of its subject. So let me say something about the secular university. I work in an English and Comparative Literary Studies department at the University of Warwick. Warwick was established in 1965 as part of a government initiative to expand higher education to students to whom the older, more established universities did not appeal. The university was set up with 3 faculties: arts, social sciences, and life sciences. There was and is no more a theology department. They've never had a theology department within Warwick, and they don't really teach religion. There's a little bit of teaching about religion in the teacher training programme that's affiliated to Warwick. There are many colleagues, of course, in history, philosophy, and English who address the subject in individual projects. But the university firmly identifies itself as a secular institution, and it prioritizes business studies, economics, engineering, and manufacturing. And yet the area in which Warwick is based, Warwickshire and the city of Coventry, is a space of deep faith. Coventry is 44% Christian, over 10% Muslim, 5% Sikh, 4% Hindu, and a small Jewish community. And across the county of Warwickshire, nearly 60% openly identify as practicing Christians, according to the most recent statistics that I can find online. The Catholic chaplaincy at Warwick is one of the largest in the UK, in part because of the university's commitment to international recruitment from Latin America. And my discussion today is about Christianity, both because I am a Roman Catholic and because my research and teaching addresses Christian literature, theology, and mysticism. But similar arguments about teaching mysticism in the secular university, I think should be made by those who work on Sufism, Vedanta, Gnosticism, Vajrayana. And of course, my ideal would be to teach alongside those specialists to explore mystical theology in its broadest remit. Warwick is no doubt one of the most inclusive places I've worked, and most religious persuasions are celebrated insofar as the university regularly advertises non-Christian holidays, feasts, and fasts. And of course, Christian holidays are marked by the usual time off associated with Christmas and Easter. But religious inclusivity at Warwick, as in many secular universities in the UK, which arguably is most of them, seems to me to be granted as a kind of secular kindness. The governing ethos of the secular university accepts that individuals might have faith, and they'll support scholars working on culture and history of different religions. But support for asking metaphysical questions in the classroom or in research, questions about the love of God, the praise of God, and religious experience are absent. Outside of some of the older institutions, university chaplaincies in the UK tend to be tiny and underfunded, as they are at Warwick. And again, at Warwick, theology is not only absent from curricula and research, but there is little willingness to connect with local churches and priests at a time when the university is desperate to reach out to the public and think about impact, how our work impacts the world. Few academics, secular or otherwise, would now deny that the context of Christianity in the Bible is essential to reading the English literary canon. As academics in the UK begin to explore global literatures, those scholars too will have to think about the religious specificities and divine texts of the writers and the places they study. But the teaching of mystical theology has many other challenges. For many students, for example, mysticism means drugs, the paranormal, magic, altered consciousness. Is then mysticism bound to be nothing more than a historical curiosity from which we must be objectively removed to study and analyze? Or is it possible to teach the metaphysical and mysterious meanings of mysticism and reveal to students that the knowledge it offers is very different to other knowledges taught on university and school curricula, and I think more fulfilling? And I hope to say a bit more about what I mean by fulfilling in a moment. Let me move to just say a few words about the current debate around whether theology should be taught in a secular institution. In his book, Philosophy and Social Hope, okay, thank you. In his book, Philosophy and Social Hope, the philosopher Richard Rorty argues that the secularization of public life was the Enlightenment's central achievement, and that the job of the academic is to get, quote, our fellow citizens to rely less on tradition and to be more willing to experiment with new customs and institutions. He claims that religion is nothing more than the attempt to make one's own private way of giving meaning to one's own life obligatory for the general public, and by consequence, the student. The theologian Donald Weeb agrees and suggests that any theological discussion of God infects the academic study of religion like a disease. That's Weeb's word, is it infects. Religious studies, he argues, should function only as an empirical discipline in pursuit of provable facts. Presumably, you know, the history of the church, how many people go to that church, etc. So then you make kind of theology into religious studies and then say it's kind of a good thing to talk about because here's all the measurable things we can say about it. On the other side of the debate, Gavin Dicastery argues that by imposing a secular model of intellectual pursuit on all academics, the specificity of humans thinking and speaking truth from the particularities of their memories and expectations disappears. Not to mention that the university will no longer produce any theologians. And more extreme is John Milbank's argument that we should reinstate theology as the queen of the sciences, because the questions and objects all other disciplines study are inherently related to their ultimate source in the being of God. And I agree with Milbank. I think that is right, but I also struggle to imagine how that might work in universities where there is no theology department at a time when universities that do have theology departments are shutting them down. So for my part, thinking about and teaching mystical theology and the unseen truths of Christianity through mystic writers is an open invitation to students. It's an invitation to both discern and challenge the ideas that these mystical writers bring. I think it is essential for students of all religious persuasions and none to see the reality of faith and the real presence of God in mystical Christian texts. And I also think that the way mystical theology engages questions of being, grace, the soul, and prayer helps us to think about what it means to worship God, whether one does or not. Certainly, other departments have their gods. It is difficult to imagine a business school or an economics department that does not worship the god of money. And most disciplines have their ethical and social commitments that appear as gods. Having taught in universities for over 30 years, I have found, however, that students are compelled by texts that ask questions about revelation, wisdom, contemplation, and prayer. In doing so, they are freed from the pressures of constantly thinking about the state of the world, constantly thinking about their mental health, and they are given time to think about a subject that engages their interior selves, but is not self-help, CBT, or mindfulness. Nor is mystical theology a social and ethical form of religious seeking in which one's relationship with God is swapped for a personal feeling of divinity or a set of good works. In other words, my argument for teaching mystical theology has nothing to do with civic goodness. I'm not really interested in trying to make students better people. I'm not sure how I would do that. We will have hugely different experiences and understandings of what being good means. The philosophers are incredibly good at talking about that. But I think mystical theology is about the love and worship of God. And that's what I want to talk about in the classroom. I'm not suggesting that the study of mystical theology should convert anybody to a particular faith. But I am arguing that mystical theology works against what the secular university currently aims to produce: job-ready graduates prepared to enter the labour market, boost the economy, and commit to an Enlightenment model of progress in which we unquestioningly attempt to succeed at whatever the newest thing might be, from colonising the cosmos to AI. If being compassionate and thoughtful helps our students to do those things, then the secular university will find ways to teach it. But as we know and have experienced ourselves, our families, our students, being and working in a modern liberal, neoliberal economy is difficult, exhausting, draining, stressful. It is damaging to mental health and physical health. It leaves little time for friends and families to be together, free of worries about money or health. And most importantly, it leaves little time to spend with God. Universities need to teach ways of being that are not based on measurements, rankings, salaries, and success. And I should say many of the students that I have taught who do come to talk to me about moments of grace and being and prayer and texts often have failed their degree. They have dropped out. They have not been people that have succeeded. And I think that's our failure, not theirs, because of the way in which we assess them. They're incredibly bright students. The poet Robert Graves is often cited as saying, there's no money in poetry, but then there's no poetry in money either. But there is money in poetry, and the creative arts in universities is celebrated for directing many students into affluent, creative career prospects, and they celebrate awards for prizes, achievements, the best poem, the best play, the best novel. But for Christian writers who discuss mysticism, or who are called mystical, creative poetry and prose is not a replacement for religious feeling and faith, as Matthew Arnold worried, but rather a way, in John Henry Newman's words, to penetrate below the surface of things. In a sermon from 1839, Newman argued that the 19th century was predominantly practical in comparison to, quote, the deeper, more mystical, more subtle, contemplative age of the Church Fathers. Newman wrote that there was no point trying to imitate this former age. We can't go back to that point. But what we can do is encourage Christians, fellow Christians, to learn how to access that world through the imagination. And Newman says, poetry then is our mysticism. And so far as any two characters of mind tend to penetrate below the surface of things and to draw men away from the material to the invisible world, so far as they may certainly be said to answer the same end, and that too a religious one. This aestheticization of mysticism in poetry does not exchange religion for aesthetics, nor does it create a set of aesthetic guidelines through which to read a text. To bring mysticism into conversation with poetry, with students, does not mean that mysticism can be taught simply by looking up specific poems that might be called mysticism or mystical or written by mystics, nor is it to assert a kind of mystical mode of exegesis that can then be applied to any poem, sacred or secular. Rather, the teaching of mystical theology puts center stage in the minds of students those ideas common within mysticism: being, soul, grace, and prayer. As Rachel Maritain, Jacques Maritain's wife, argued, poetry opens the reader into intuitive, speculative, and spiritually structuring ways of reading and interpretation in the presence of God. And many of us might find this poetry in the church, that space that all women mystics I have read identify strongly with as a fellow female creative space. As Rachel was helping me think about the other day, the church is feminine. What do we do then when we start to critique the Catholic Church and suggest that it is no longer a space in which women can thrive, when all of these women are thriving and writing and finding ways to feel liberated and have a relationship with God, in which they are guided by Christ as well as Our Lady? Now, to finish, I'd like to offer a specific example of my argument. And I'm going to take just one of those topics from Being, Soul, Grace and Prayer and focus on being. Despite the vast mystical canon addressing being, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Eckhart, Dionysius, Julian of Norwich, and so on, most textbooks about being devote substantial space to Martin Heidegger. It is almost impossible to think about a conversation about being without referencing Heidegger. There'll be lots of people in this room who understand Heidegger better than I do, but for the sake of my argument, let me say in the briefest of terms, Heidegger argued that philosophy had over time ignored being, and that being was inseparable from the world because one is always being somewhere or being with something or with someone. Without ever really defining being himself, Heidegger claimed that only a future generation more attuned to what he called the, quote, emanations of being would really be able to understand being. He also famously argued that only a poetic language and a poetic thinking could ever begin to conjure or articulate being. But Heidegger was also a profoundly anti-Semitic Nazi, and so argued that being could only be poetically expressed by someone who is German in an originary way, whom he considered ontologically superior to others, and whom is rooted in the soil of German land. Those who were rootless, by which he means, of course, the Jewish people, were incapable of understanding being, Heidegger argued, and so existence. And if anyone is interested in reading a sort of analysis of the way in which Heidegger's works have had his anti-Semitism edited out, I really recommend Richard Wolin's book, Heidegger in Ruins, which makes it clear that it's not just the revelation of his anti-Semitism in his black notebooks, but across his work from the very beginning of his career. Now, Heidegger formulated these ideas while working with the phenomenologist, the Jewish Edmund Husserl, who fully opposed Heidegger's Nazism and, of course, lost his job as a result. Husserl was himself a convert from Judaism to Lutheranism and worked with several other Jewish converts to Catholicism, most significantly Edith Stein, now Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. But her work has only a fraction of the purchase of Heidegger's, despite its clear distinction. Stein is an extraordinary figure. Her collected works run into 30 volumes. She wrote theology, philosophy, poetry. She has an extraordinary book on being that is much more interesting than Heidegger and, importantly, not anti-Semitic. Stein was a Jewish Catholic. She converted from Judaism in 1922 and then became a Catholic nun. But she insisted on her identity as a Jewish Catholic writer of philosophy, theology, and poetry. And in that sense, has a very interesting relationship to someone like Rasha Maritain, who is a Russian Jew who moved to France and with Jacques Maritain, her husband, converted to Catholicism, but Rasha still very much saw herself as a Jewish Catholic. Now, Stein published her doctoral thesis as supervised by Husserl on the problem of empathy. Stein argued that consciousness itself was collaborative and empathetic in the sense that to be conscious of anything, one had to have the capacity to imagine another point of view. As Rowan Williams writes, Stein's work anticipates by several decades most of the work about the mind by other philosophers in this period, particularly Sartre and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Stein's case for being was similar to her notion of empathy. In her 1935-36 Finite and Eternal Being, an attempt to ascend to the meaning of being, Stein claimed that being was not rooted, but rather ascended to God. Responding to John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, Stein considered what being meant as both a finite human idea and a divine eternal idea. She describes finite being as participatory and relational with the eternal being of God, and states that all beings are called to communion with God. In ascending to God, she writes, finite beings rise above natural experience, quote, to glimpse the possibility of a kind of knowledge that has no further need of sensible ways of access. In other words, Stein thinks we need to imagine a way of thinking in which the possibilities of a higher spiritual living and being can be grasped, even if it cannot be felt, attained, said, or sensed in our earthly life. And that kind of way of thinking is the one that I think would be very helpful to teach in the university. Now, to imagine in this way, Stein argues, we need to go beyond our usual categories of thinking, willing, and experiencing, and do so directly through the soul. While Heidegger has very little use for theological readings of the soul, Stein defines the soul as an embodied aspect of the unchanging reality of God within us. As she argues in her 1922 treatise, Individual and Community, what is this mysterious something, the soul? The peculiarity of the essence that a soul has is this, to be weighted down and settled in its own self. Here is a way to think about how it feels to be not rooted in blood and soil, but weighted down and settled in God, quietened and soothed by giving one's being over to God and experiencing the feeling of closeness and intimacy with God as enduring and changeless. How many students have we in this room alone taught for whom this way of being might help? What might happen if mystical theology was compulsory on every degree? If they exchanged modules on citizenship, industry, internships, innovation, well-being? These are modules that the students that I teach in a literature department do not want to do. They are compulsory. Might mysticism redefine the idea of interdisciplinarity, not as the combining of profitable subjects in repackaged degree programs or research applications, but as an illuminating interlacing of different disciplines guided by the Queen of the Sciences? How liberating might it be for young people to glimpse not the self-projected picture of reality, but the real world of the divine, in which they might read the world and the things with which we coexist within it, through a marriage within themselves of supernatural revelation and natural reason. In mystical theology, of course, we find much that is valuable in literary studies. That's why they work so well together. The development of discernment, close interpretation of texts and the world, imaginative contemplation, focused and concentrated reflection. But these are ideas that are increasingly undermined in English departments. They are not part of what we are asked to do in most literary departments today. The frameworks in which we are assessed by the government do not care about imaginative contemplation. They care about job-ready graduate students who can be ranked according to how much they earn when they graduate with their degree. Mystical theology, however, is a tradition that cannot really be instrumentalized in this way as a critical skill or a thoughtful talent. Rather, it asks the student to read long and complex texts from the ancient world to the present. Education spills over with assessments and tests and subjects that fulfill pedagogical priorities of achievement and success. Why not make one subject mandatory that offers a different experience? So when I say teaching mystical theology in the university, I simply mean asking students to read mystical texts. I don't want to assess them on it. I don't want to tell them that they're right or wrong. I just want them to read it and then come to a room and talk with me and their fellow students about it. To close, I'd like to read the first and last verses from Stein's 1942 poem, 7 Beams from a Pentecost Novena. Stein wrote this poem a few months after she had finished her book on John of the Cross, The Science of the Cross, and only a couple of months before she was arrested by the Gestapo and murdered in Auschwitz. I read these to end because for me, they imbue that weighted feeling Stein identifies in a soul alive to God in search of changeless love. This might be felt, experienced, or even simply noticed through the teaching of mystical theology. I think students should engage with this alongside the important lessons that they learn from historians about historical context, from psychologists about the emergence of different modes of feeling and awareness, from literary critics about how the sound and the rhythm of the poem work. But they also need a theological space in which to approach the incomprehensible, but internally abundant and generative concept of being soul, grace, prayer, and also spirit and divine love, which Stein captures here in her poetry. It would be difficult for me to ask a student to write an essay on these poems because I'm not sure what that would achieve. What I would like them to do is read them. Who are you, sweet light, that fills me and illumines the darkness of my heart? You guide me like a mother's hand, and if you let me go, I could not take another step. You are the space that surrounds and contains my being. Without you, it would sink into the abyss of nothingness, from which you raised it into being. You closer to me than I to myself. Holy Spirit, eternal love. Are you the sweet song of love and of holy awe, resounding ever round God's throne triune, which unifies the pure tone of all beings within itself? The harmony which fits the limbs to the head, so that each blissfully finds the secret meaning of his being and exudes it with gladness, freely dissolved in your streams. Holy Spirit, eternal jubilation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very rich food for thought there. And we have about 20 minutes before for lunch to engage in some questions. So I'll just throw open the floor.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, very happy to.
In fact, I'm going to be an autocratic theologian. Maybe I just put the first question. And just warming very much to the general point that you put across there. Do you feel at any point a need to distinguish between mysticism and spirituality? It's the other big word.
I think that, yes, because I think the mystical tradition for me is linked to theology and the love of God and union with God, whereas spirituality can be felt in relation to God, but it can also be felt in relation to a beautiful mountain or tree or landscape, which one may well see as divine, but doesn't have to. And I think one of the things that I remember reading, when I was an undergraduate, was how mysticism was this alternative system to the church. It was always outside of it and it was very critical of the church. That isn't what I have found in reading any of those texts myself. They are
living in churches or they're part of the church. And certainly these women from the 20th century are very devout to the church. So I think spirituality may remove the church aspect, which I would see as unhelpful.
Thanks. Let me take a couple of questions in the front there, and then we'll move to the back. The hands should be raised up.
Thank you, Anna. I was really interested in how you talk about imagination quite a lot. I read a lot about mysticism knowledge, and a lot of talk about mysticism poetry and imagination, but not about mysticism and imagination. And I think sometimes makes people quite nervous because it's already a sort of sphere in which there's a sense of people making this up. That's going to ask me a lot. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the link between mysticism and imagination, and is imagination central to mysticism, or you need a mystical experience to have imagination, and how that intersects with grace as well.
Yeah, oh, thank you. Well, so I think that one definitely doesn't have to have a mystical experience. And I mean, again, because I'm kind of trying to think about the classroom situation here, not all students would want them. Many would be horrified by them and be actually hostile about having them. And yet their imaginations, I think, will be greatly enhanced by reading the mystics. As you'll know, mystical writings are bonkers. They are full of these ideas that no one has really put together before. And so many of the social media feeds, which of course I'm not on, as I'm far too old now. But I have seen various Instagram feeds about medieval art, much of which is clearly religious in various ways. And the images there are very popular on social media because they're so weird. They're dogs' heads on chickens' bodies, kind of, playing the violin on top of a church floating in the sea, in the middle of outer space. And, that's pure imagination. And I would much rather just talk about those and show some images and ask the students what they really think about them. Even if they come back to me and say, that's all a load of rubbish and I'm not interested and I'd rather go and be in my history class, that's fine. And then they can go to their history class, but they also have to come and talk about mystical theology. And I do think that the way, it's not just the way we've instrumentalized the university in terms of the way it needs to be a place of productiveness and profit, but even in the assessments that we do, we're measuring students all the time. And I just don't think it's helpful, and I don't want to do it really. And I also think it blocks a conversation with people that, in the old sense of the word, the humanities was about human beings being in a room together and listening to each other and really hearing what they've got to say. And I think we've sort of split that off by saying, here are the well-being people that you can go and talk to about your feelings, and here are your tutors where you can go and talk to about literature. Now, I don't want to hear the students' pastoral worries because I'm not a specialist in mental health, but I do want to hear what they think about these texts in relation to who they are as human beings. So I guess that's where I would say that mysticism and the imagination are so kind of productive together, because I think they just produce these extraordinary images that are often, they are the basis of the imaginative works that we read, into the 21st century. I hope that sort of answers. Yeah.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking lecture. One of the questions that occurred to me is how much do you think that this is about the colonisation or the ghettoisation of the word knowledge to exclude anything that is not empirically verifiable?
Yes.
The measurement thing. You say, who's going to measure the measureless?
Yeah.
By what criteria do we measure needs examining?
Yeah.
Would you like to say something about that? That mystical knowledge is knowledge.
Yeah.
It's not just of the fairies.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm sure that the university will find many people to measure the measurers, and then some other people to measure the measurers and pay them extraordinary salaries while they sack everyone else who teaches theology because they haven't got any money. So that would be one way to kind of solve the university funding crisis. I think you're absolutely right that mystical knowledge, you know, for me, it is about love of God. You know, it's taken me a long, long time to get to the point where I can talk about love of God in an academic environment. And it's probably, you know, there's all of those other questions about what it means to even sort of think about Christianity in a very secular environment like the university. However, I think I'm trying to argue something a bit different today, which is that the mystical knowledge that students might get from reading those texts, it is unmeasurable. And that might mean that they actually don't know anything about mysticism at the end of it, but they might know something else. So that's why I'm suggesting that, you know, while I think that the work that's been done on mysticism in history departments, for example, is phenomenal, and of course I read it and love it and think it's incredibly interesting, I'm not a historian, and that's not what I can do. What I can do is sit and think about the imagination with students and get them to read these texts. And I know where these texts are, and I know how to kind of put them together. And I work with colleagues who can say to me, well, you really ought to put this Sufist mystic in conversation with this person, or this Vajrayana person in conversation. That would be my ideal, so that it could be global, but not comparative for comparative sake, just simply because students often respond very well when they see themselves in a text. So, you know, if it's quite true that at Warwick we don't have very many students who are Christians, but we do have quite a lot of students that are Hindu and Muslim, and of course the traditions there are extraordinary. All of those ideas can kind of would coalesce, but they can't sort of be measured, which is why I'm not sure an exam on it was really going to kind of do very much, especially if they're examined in lots of other ways. So I'm not arguing no assessment, no kind of testing them, you know, I'm not suggesting it's just all a jolly and they come out. I'm saying one subject, and that should be mysticism.
Yeah, a couple of questions down on this side, and then we're going to go back to them. And say David's latest. And then you pass the mic to the person behind.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk. I was just thinking, you know, if I went into church, you know, the first thing I heard was that poem by Peter Stein, I would maybe be much more inspired than just going in and, you know, hearing the conventional literature all the time, which one can, you know, get into in a way, not experience as novel. But I'm from Oxford, and I had quite creepy encounter with the Jesuit at Captain Hall, who was doing his PhD on Marilyn Robinson and Jill Hall. But he also has a very interesting lecture from the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies on Nicholas of Cusa. But he does say at the end of this lecture, Catholicism is cautious of mystical experience because it doesn't involve a common language, even though he was very into poetry himself. And I suppose I first came across Julian of Norwich in a novel called about Catherine, John of Gaunt's mistress, and that really set me off on a whole mystical trail. And I had a profound experience through reading probably in the end. But I suppose my reservation would be, and in Buddhism this is particularly held up, that by elevating this experience, that one can seek after something which in some ways, you know, you can't grasp. It has to be lived into, and is a gift of grace. But I completely agree with you that actually reading the mystics can involve imagination and carry the spirit somewhere where, you know, it wouldn't naturally go. But I still see the church very afraid of this, you know.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really interesting to hear about your experience as well. I think I've got two things to say about it. The first is that at my own church, we do have a priest that's very open to literature. I'm not sure that he's hugely interested in it himself, but he's very open to it. And he has allowed various groups to take over Stations of the Cross during Lent, and at each station read a poem. Of course, there are some very beautiful poems that are directly about the Stations of the Cross, and there are other poems that just directly relate to the images that we have in our particular church. So I think there are ways to kind of bring them together. I think Pope Francis has spoken extraordinarily about literature and the importance of it, and that, you know, priests should read it, Catholics should read it. And I think that's been, you know, amazingly inspiring for me. On the question of sort of what it's, the kind of what it's doing and not kind of asserting a common language, I would say from, you know, and from my very limited experience, and this, a Jesuit in Campion Hall is going to know a lot more than I am, but I would say that it does, because the shared experience is to love God. And that's, I think, what I'm interested in. Now, would I be, you know, if I was living in the medieval period and I wasn't allowed to do anything else apart from go and sit in a convent and love God, I might have done something else. You know, I would have wanted to be out there doing a bit of reading and writing and wearing a pair of trousers, for example. But I'm not in that period. I'm in a massively secular world. And I think one of the things that I find really helpful in William Blake's work is that when he sort of talks about the relationship between opposites and not favouring one or the other, so many critics come to that and say, oh, Blake's a relativist, you know, nothing makes sense. But that's not what he's saying at all. He's saying, look at what is dominant in a particular time and balance it up. You know, look at the French Revolution and look at war, and let us talk about angels, because that is a language that is contrary to the kind of horror of the French Revolution and you know, the murders that were happening then. And one might make a similar kind of argument for any time in our world. At any time in our world, there's war and there's violence, and perhaps that love of God aspect of religion isn't always brought through. But for me, as a Catholic convert, having come to it and seen what the Catholic Church is committed to doing, despite all of the things that I can see are problematic, what I see in it is this deep commitment to love of God. And I think that in a university space, I know it's sort of, you know, a lot of people would be very uncomfortable with it, but, you know, a mental health crisis that we're in now, again, from my limited experience, to me, what that is about is people don't feel loved. And I think, you know, it is not the job of tutors to love their students, but it is the job of tutors to explore those questions with them and not make them feel as though they are questions they shouldn't ask, but also not divert those questions into scientific fields like neuroscience or affect theory, or all of these things where we suddenly say, oh, we're going to talk about emotion now, we're going to wire somebody up to a computer and, you know, and show them a picture of a spider. And if, you know, if this bit of their brain lights up, it means they're frightened. Well, you know what, I could have told you that before you spent £2 million on a machine kind of measuring their being frightened of a spider. You know, it's free to sit and talk to students about mystical theology, and it's also nearly all out of copyright that the medievals don't have any of those problems either, which is, I think, kind of a plus point. But yes, I mean, obviously I can see that there's kind of tensions there. I would just say one more thing, which I was talking to Hilary about yesterday, which is that in sort of looking at Pope Pius X's response to modernism, which I've seen cited in so many books. Oh, Pius, you know, he didn't like modernism, said it's synthesis of all heresies, you know, completely anti-mystical. He doesn't say that at all. You know, that the encyclical has a lot of space for what it means to have a personal relationship with God. He just doesn't want it to be one that's driven by atheists, which for a Pope is fair enough.
My last question here.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Can I focus on the secular university?
Yes.
Part? I mean, in the UK, there's 3 Catholic universities in addition to Catholic institutions within secular university. Do you think they should be far more willing to highlight their distinctiveness and discuss?
Absolutely.
Or do you think they're under a lot of pressure in order to conform to the general system?
Well, I think they are under pressure, of course, but I do think that it would be helpful to be more vocal. I mean, because of the kind of subjects I teach at Warwick, a lot of the students that come up, they've got a bit of an interest in spirituality or something to do with religion. They're not sure. And one of the places that we often get is the Quakers. You know, a lot of young people, they like the Quakers because it feels like religion without all the doctrine and without the kind of moral, that their perception of what they think is moral condemnation. And that may well be true, of course. You know, I think all of these subjects can be taught, and all of, you know, very ecumenical approach to mystical theology is going to be the best one. But I do think there's something important about the Catholic Church for me that is very focused on love of God and worship of God. And that's what I have heard in, you know, since by going to church, is a priest that stands up and might say something about the readings of that day and might say something about what's going on in the world. But at the end will say, but it's about love of God. So it isn't sort of politicized in that way. It isn't sort of, the pulpit doesn't become this political space that I think traditionally it has done sometimes in Protestant tradition. And I think about someone like, you know, John Wesley, or, you know, and of course I think that those things have been very important, but at this point in time, I think it might be more political to just say to people, you know, love God and God loves you, and let's explore some texts that say that. And if one might get past the sort of discomfort of that and the kind of bristle of the like, oh, like, you know, that sounds sentimental nonsense, and you know, I don't believe in anything. If you can kind of get past that into the sort of affective experience that these texts are looking at, I think a little bit like what Mark was saying yesterday when he was talking about God and Market being this incredible poem that sort of tests what we think about ourselves within the university, but always in Rossetti, there's this focus on love. I mean, Christina Rossetti's, one of the reasons I, you know, really love Christina Rossetti is because I think she's one of the only poets to have written the sentence, love, oh, lovely, lovely love. I mean, it's scanned, so it's okay, the literary critic. But I mean, that's the focus for her. And for me, that has been my experience of the Catholic Church. Now, I know that's not the experience of everybody, and it's not the experience of people that I know and who are friends and in my family too. But I think that the Jesuits have an extraordinary amount to contribute. And the things that I've been to, conferences, events, discussions of literature in these Catholic spaces, have really got me thinking about the literary text. And I will say that I think sometimes that does get a bit lost from some of the literature conferences I go to, where we don't often talk about the text. We talk about anything but. So my answer is yes.
We do need to finish. Is that okay, John? Are we ready for? So I think lunch is ready. I'll just finish with I mentioned the Quakers reminded me of the experience of a Jesuit colleague, Indian Jesuit colleague of mine, who came to Dublin, and major culture shock, in particular in the university, with its big stress on diversity and so on. And he was finding a lot of the LGBTQ stuff a little bit threatening. So he was encouraged to go on to a queer-friendly church on Sunday morning. And he pitched up at a Quaker meeting house, wondered what all the fuss was about. So it's important to give as much information as people need to find what they need. Anyway, yeah. Emma, that's been absolutely fantastic. Thanks very much indeed. The conversation will continue, so I'm sorry to those people who didn't get a chance to ask their questions. The conversation will be continuing throughout the day. So thank you very much indeed.